was Trudeau who introduced the modern treatment of tuberculosis in this country. Real hospitals for the tuberculous, and not merely resting places. Here we are in a large southern sanatorium. Rest and more rest.
The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, located in Weston, West Virginia, was originally built with good intentions. Construction began around 1858 with the vision of providing a humane environment for mentally ill patients. Architect Richard Snowden Andrews, a prominent Baltimore-based designer who had served as a Confederate officer, created the layout based on the Kirkbride Plan, a widely used 19th century psychiatric hospital design that emphasized long staggered wings and natural light ventilation, with serene surroundings. The belief was that the environment itself could be part of the cure, and the design was intended to promote healing through order, structure, and beauty. When the asylum opened in 1864, the Civil War was raging, and initially it served as a military hospital. After the war, it returned to its intended use as a psychiatric hospital. Early reports suggested patients were treated decently with individual care plans, but as the years passed, things drastically changed. The hospital became extremely overcrowded, far beyond its intended capacity of 250 patients. At its worst, there was over 2,400 people crowded inside there, creating chaotic and unhealthy conditions. The overcrowding led to neglect and harsh treatments. Staff struggled to manage the huge influx of patients, and as resources dwindled away, the conditions worsened dramatically. Treatments became extremely severe, including insulin shock therapy, electroshock treatments without anesthesia, might I add, and hydrotherapy where patients were submerged in icy baths. Now, I know this doesn't sound bad because people do it now, but back then it probably wasn't great. But perhaps the most troubling practice was lobotomies. Doctors perform more than 4,000 of these invasive brain surgeries, often with crude instruments like ice picks inserted through eye sockets. And I'm sure their version was a bit different, but they're very similar. Some procedures were done without proper medical justification, leading to permanent brain damage in a lot of these patients, and sometimes even death. There were many horrible things that happened at this place, but one specific incident involved a 49-year-old patient named Dean Metheny. He was mute and intellectually disabled, known for being extremely quiet and withdrawn from the crowd of people that were there. But in September of 1987, he was placed in a shared room in Ward F with two younger men, David Mason and James Woods, both of whom had extremely long histories of violent and erratic behavior. So clearly, this wasn't a good matchup. The decision to house the three of them together went largely unnoticed as a result of the facility's overcrowding and severe understaffing. What happened that night would go down as one of the most disturbing murders ever recorded in a state-owned hospital. According to investigators, Mason and Woods decided, seemingly without motive, that they were just going to kill Dean. They first tied a bed sheet around his neck and attempted to hang him from a pipe above. But when that failed, they decided they would beat him and just stomp on him as much as they could. They then placed his head under the leg of one of the metal bed frames, and they jumped on the bed itself, using their weight to force the bedpost through Dean's skull. Dean was eventually discovered on the floor of the room, surrounded by his own blood. We don't even know how long after this happened. The murder, later dubbed the bedpost killing, shocked the public and drew immediate scrutiny from lawmakers and mental health advocates of the time. Both Mason and Woods were arrested and charged. Mason, who led the attack, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole. Woods, whose mental state was considered during the trial, also received a lengthy sentence, though the exact outcome was handled separately due to psychiatric evaluations. But the main reason that I bring this up is that this incident really made the way for a lot of the public outrage that eventually led to the asylum's closure, which finally came in 1994, leaving behind decades of pain and suffering. Now, today, the building stands mostly empty and is preserved as a historical site that visitors can tour. But many who visit report experiencing strange and unsettling events, reinforcing the asylum's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Stories of paranormal activity started circulating almost immediately after its closure. Former employees had already mentioned extremely strange occurrences like figures appearing at windows or moving through rooms when nobody else was around. Visitors today frequently mention feeling watched or followed. The sensation is often described as heavy or oppressive, like a lingering sadness trapped within the walls themselves. One ghost frequently reported is that of a little girl named Lily. According to local accounts, Lily was born in the asylum and tragically died of pneumonia at a very young age. Visitors and tour guides regularly experience her playful presence, especially in the children's ward. Toys move on their own, balls roll mysteriously across the floors, and some have even felt tiny cold hands reaching for theirs, trying gently to lead them down the empty hallways. The third floor, which once housed violent patients, is another hotspot for these paranormal sightings. Visitors often describe sudden drops in temperature and an intense, uneasy feeling. Tour guides recall instances of locking eyes with these shadowy entities, only to see them vanish into thin air moments later. But perhaps the most chilling are the reports from the morgue and basement areas. Footsteps are typically heard echoing through the empty corridors. Doors slam shut without reason, and once again, shadowy forms have been seen lingering around old autopsy tables. Paranormal investigators conducting overnight sessions have captured very clear voices on audio recordings responding intelligently to questions, sometimes asking for help or expressing confusion about their circumstances. Today, most of the visitors that do go to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum are there for tours and paranormal investigations, drawn in by its dark history and chilling reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Located on a quiet hill just outside Louisville, Kentucky, is one of the most infamous buildings in American history. Its massive brick structure sits above the treetops like a forgotten fortress, and its name has become synonymous with suffering and death. But long before any of those stories, Waverly Hills Sanatorium began as something much simpler, a schoolhouse built on a peaceful piece of land. In 1883, Major Thomas Hayes purchased the land with the intention of building a family home. With very few local schools nearby, he also constructed a small one-room schoolhouse for his daughters. The teacher he hired was Lizzie Lee Harris. She was a fan of the Waverly novels by Sir Walter Scott, and she named the school after them. Hayes liked the name, so he just decided to call his entire property Waverly Hill. By the early 1900s, Louisville faced a growing crisis. Tuberculosis, often referred to as the White Plague, was sweeping through the population. The disease was highly contagious and extremely deadly, and the city's medical facilities were overwhelmed. Doctors and public health officials needed an isolated location where patients could be quarantined and treated away from the general population. The peaceful elevated land at Waverly Hills was seen as the perfect place. In 1910, the original Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened, a modest two-story wooden structure that could hold around 40 patients. At the time, there was no known cure for tuberculosis. Doctors were relying on methods that they believed could slow the disease. Things such as rest and sunlight or clean air and food. The approach was gentle, but the disease was not. TB spread quickly and the number of infected patients skyrocketed. Before long, Waverly Hills was completely overwhelmed. To manage the overflow, tents and temporary shacks were set up on the grounds, but it wasn't really enough. In 1924, construction began on a new, much larger facility, and by 1926, a 5-story Gothic brick structure stood on the hill. A massive state-of-the-art sanatorium capable of treating over 400 patients at a time. With its own power plant, post office, laundry, and even farmland, Waverly Hills functioned like a self-contained city. Once a patient was admitted, they rarely left the property, and many never did. The treatments administered inside weren't what we'd recognize today as effective. In the absence of antibiotics, doctors turned to desperate and often brutal methods. Patients were encouraged to sit outside even in winter for hours, sometimes covered in snow, under the belief that the fresh air would heal their lungs. More extreme cases underwent surgeries like thoracoplasty, where ribs were removed to allow diseased lungs to collapse and rest. Others had balloons inflated inside their lungs and underwent complete lung removal. These procedures were painful, risky, and rarely successful. Most of these patients did not survive. Estimates vary on how many people died at Waverly Hills, but historical records suggest around 8,000 deaths occurred during its time as a tuberculosis hospital. Staff at the sanatorium went to great lengths to preserve hope among the patients that were there. One method was the use of a 525-foot tunnel beneath the building that led from the hospital to the bottom of the hill. Originally, it was designed as a supply route for coal and food food delivery. It was eventually used to discreetly move bodies of the deceased rather than carrying corpses through the main building, where other patients might see them. They were wheeled down the tunnel on carts. Over time, it became known as something a bit darker. They called it the body chute. By the late 1940s, a breakthrough changed everything. The discovery and use of streptomycin, the first effective antibiotic for tuberculosis, meant that sanatoriums like Waverly Hills were no longer needed. Recovery was finally possible. Admissions dropped off, and then the once overpopulated facility grew extremely quiet. And in 1961, Waverly Hills officially closed its doors as a tuberculosis hospital. The building reopened a year later under a new name, the Woodhaven Geriatric Center. It was converted into a long-term care facility for the elderly and individuals with severe and physical mental disabilities. But the transformation didn't bring new life to Waverly. Underfunding, neglect, and overcrowding quickly led to deteriorating conditions. Reports of patient mistreatment and unsanitary practices were, let's just say, quite popular. And by 1980, the state shut down Woodhaven for good. Ownership changed hands several times, with failed attempts to repurpose the building. A few examples here are a prison, they tried to do apartments, and even a giant statue of Jesus. But none of those things ever materialized. The once grand sanatorium was left to rot. Vandals broke in and nature took over, and then stories began to surface about Waverly Hills not just being abandoned, but haunted. Today, the building has been partially restored and is maintained by the Waverly Hills Historical Society, founded by its current owners, Charlie and Tina Mattingly. While some visit for the architecture or to learn about its medical history, many come hoping to experience something paranormal. And according to a steady stream of visitors and investigators, Waverly Hills doesn't disappoint. The body chute is often one of the first stops on ghost tours. Guests will often describe sudden drops in temperature, voices in the tunnels, or heavy footsteps behind them when no one else is there. Some people even leave the tunnel visibly shaken up, claiming they felt as though someone was watching them or even following them while on the tour. Another popular area is room 502, perhaps the most infamous room in the entire building. According to local lore, a nurse took her own life in this room during the 1920s, after learning that she was pregnant out of wedlock. Another version just says that she was hanging from a light fixture, and it seems that the story varies depending on who you ask. A second nurse is also rumored to have jumped from the rooftop or the balcony just outside the same room, again, depending on who you ask. No official records have ever confirmed these deaths, but the stories still persist. Maybe they were lost to time, who knows? Regardless, visitors report hearing whispers or seeing unexplained figures, even feeling a sudden wave of despair as soon as they step inside the room. There are also mentions involving a young spirit known as Timmy, who is said to be the ghost of a child who died at Waverly Hills. Timmy reportedly plays with toys left behind by guests. People have left rubber balls in hallways only to watch them roll on their own, and then other people say they've heard faint giggling or tiny footsteps following them around the children's ward or on upper floors. Now, one of the more unsettling entities reported is the Creeper. He's described as a dark humanoid shadow that crawls on walls and ceilings. The Creeper is said to emit a feeling of overwhelming dread. It doesn't interact like the other spirits do, it just watches and lurks at the edge of your vision. Several investigators now have claimed to see it moving across rooms in ways that no human ever could. Paranormal teams from shows like Ghost Adventures and BuzzFeed Unsolved have all captured unexplained sights and sounds on camera while investigating Waverly Hills. Skeptics argue these sightings are just tricks of light or the effects of walking through a building filled with so much history of death. I mean, after all, it's pretty easy to feel spooked in a dark, crumbling structure where thousands once suffered and died. Year after year, people return with fresh accounts of things they can't explain. Today, Waverly Hills operates as a historical landmark and paranormal attraction. The Mattingleys offer daytime history tours, seasonal haunted houses, and they even offer overnight ghost hunts. Visitors will walk through the same halls where patients once struggled for breath and listen for sounds that don't belong there. Whether or not they actually believe in ghosts, most leave Waverly with a very different opinion from when they first went in. As you drive down Bethany Center Road in East Bethany, New York, the landscape changes. It isn't the city that you usually associate with New York. It's more cornfields and barns collapsing in on themselves. Eventually, you'll reach a brick building set back a bit from the road with dark windows and a rather creepy appearance. This is Rolling Hills Asylum, and for a long time, it was one of the last places that anyone ever wanted to end up. It started in 1827 when Genesee County purchased a former stagecoach tavern and turned it into the Genesee County Poorhouse. It was built for people who couldn't care for themselves: orphans, widows, elderly, people with mental illness, disabilities, or even addiction. They were called inmates, not residents, and once someone was placed there, they were often there for the rest of their lives. The facility sat on over 200 acres of land. Residents were put to work in fields raising livestock and doing other stuff. They even built coffins in the wood shop. The labor was considered therapeutic, and if someone was physically able to move, they were expected to contribute. The county kept costs low. It was about $1.08 per person for a whole week. The county records are full of numbers: crop yields, purchase orders, death statistics, but the personal details, the human part, rarely made it onto the page. More than 1,700 people died at Rolling Hills over the years, and most of them were buried without headstones. A cemetery was designated sometime in the 1880s, but eventually the map was lost and the graves were covered up. Today, there's just a single plaque near the county park acknowledging the site, and nobody really knows where the bodies are. As time went on, the place really did a bit of everything. There was an infirmary, a tuberculosis ward, a psychiatric facility, and it was later a nursing home. In the 1950s, a new wing was added on to house long-term patients. By the late 1970s, the institute shut down completely, and the remaining residents were transferred to nearby facilities in Batavia. The building was left completely empty. Eventually, curiosity brought people back. Paranormal investigators, local thrill seekers, and former staff began exploring the property. It wasn't long before people started reporting strange experiences, disembodied voices, or slamming doors, and their stories really just built from there. One of the best known figures associated with Rolling Hills is Roy. He was born with gigantism and brought to the facility when he was just 12 years old. He stood over 7 feet tall, and because of his condition, his family just couldn't care for him. Roy was known to be kind and gentle. He loved music, opera in particular, by the way, and he was never violent. People who visit now say they've heard slow, heavy footsteps behind them even when no one else is nearby. Others report seeing large handprints on walls, much too big for any of the touring guests. Sharon Coyle, who is the current owner of the property, once shared a story about finding a rat in the infirmary. She's terrified of them. The next day, the rat was found dead on the stairs with its neck snapped. Above it was a massive red handprint on the wall, and she thinks that Roy was trying to protect her. During an EVP session, a guest asked if they could sit near him. The recorder picked up a quiet voice responding, saying that would be fine. The room they were in was Roy's. Nurse Emma is another popular name. According to some who've researched the building, she worked at the Rolling Hills during one of its harsher periods and developed a reputation for being cold and controlling. There's rumors going around as well that she was involved in spiritual practices, possibly even darker ones, but that's just rumors. Another well-known figure is Hattie. She was an elderly and blind lady when she lived there. At night, she used to call out, "Hello," just to hear someone respond. It was the only way that she could be sure that she wasn't alone. Guests today say the same thing happens in her room. They hear a soft voice say, "Hello," quiet but distinct, just enough to stop them in their tracks. These experiences aren't limited to one section of the building, and one guest on a public tour even took a photo of what they thought was an empty hallway. Later, while looking at the pictures in their car, they noticed something standing just behind the corner of the wall. The laundry room also gets a lot of attention. Visitors have heard the old machine switch on even though they've been disconnected now for decades. A stuck door that hadn't moved in years suddenly opened up on its own during one investigation. Like, this is pretty spooky stuff. When asked if anyone still likes spending time in that space, a voice came through a recorder saying happy with it. Sharon, who lives on the property and manages the tour, says that the strange activity is constant. There are also stories that are a little harder to explain. A woman on a daytime tour collapsed in the solarium. When she came to, she said she had seen a woman in a white dress hovering near the windows. She said the woman was speaking, but the sound just came out like static. She also said that the room smelled extremely strongly of smoke, even though nobody had smoked in this building for decades. Not everybody leaves Rolling Hills scared. Some people just feel shaken up a bit, but they describe it as emotional more than frightening. Rolling Hills wasn't just an institution. It was a place where people were sent when society had no more use for them. People lived entire lives inside those walls, often without ever receiving a single visitor. Many died without names or markers, and the kind of sadness doesn't just disappear. And maybe that's what makes Rolling Hills so unforgettable. If you enjoyed today's video, I'd really appreciate a like and possibly even a subscription if you want to see more just like it. If you want to support the channel, I also have a Patreon. You'll find that linked in the description below. We also have a Discord group where you and a bunch of other people can come together and help me choose topics for new videos. But that's going to be it for today. Have a good night. Bye-bye.